Going on to cloud computing, the non-cyber insurance buyers have become more interested in cyber insurance due to the push at many companies to outsource applications to the cloud. What makes cloud computing different than hosting? And why was the CGL sufficient for some firms until they were outsourcing to the cloud computing firms?
I think one of the key components of that is, why was the CGL sufficient? And if I put my E&O underwriter hat back on for a second, I'm going to argue that the CGL was never really sufficient, even when we were talking about hosting versus cloud computing. I think that's a very important distinction to make. I think there certainly has been more of a push as cloud computing has really taken prominence with a lot of firms to look at the cyber policies, but I'm not sure if it's specifically related to issues with the GL policy. I don't think the exposures themselves have really changed, even though we talk a lot more about cloud computing now. Even back in the early part of the decade, or even the last decade. I mean, we were hosting and we were always outsourcing other applications. So the exposures themselves, in my opinion, haven't changed. But what has changed is the awareness, and I think particularly when you start looking at the first-party elements of a cyber liability policy, that's where the awareness has really taken effect, because a CGL policy is purely going to respond to third-party liability. There are no first-party elements to the GL policy. And so when we start looking at cloud computing, in fact, at this event last year, Peter and I were on a panel together, and we were asked to make our predictions. And I remember one of the predictions we made was, as cloud computing begins to take off and become more involved at many firms, that first-party coverage was also going to take more prominence as well. And I would say that that we're continuing to see that. And so I think that's really what's driving the demand and the discussions for the traditional non-cyber buyers. It's not so much the issues with the GL policy, but more what it doesn't include on the GL, what it does include on the cyber policy.
Great. Thank you. The last session we talked about cyber terrorism and cyber terrorism coverage under a cyber policy. The GL, does it provide terrorism coverage at all for any type of liability loss?
I mean, speaking from Zurich's perspective, we haven't seen that. We haven't seen any specific instances that have come in under the GL policy, and I think it's important to make the distinction between cyber terrorism and cyber extortion. So I think they can sometimes be used interchangeably, and cyber extortion is, I guess, a form of cyber terrorism. And as most of you know, and many markets include a cyber extortion element to cyber liability policy. So I think that is probably one area that is very clear, that it is intended to be put under the cyber liability policy, again, for the purpose of it being a first-party coverage, that there really hasn't been a question, at least that we've seen, as to it falling under the GL. I don't know if you've seen that.
Yeah, no, on the cyber terrorism side, it's not something we've specifically excluded on our form, and I've been asked, I've requested on a lot of occasions to provide that coverage proactively. The issue I've had is I'm not quite sure what I'm being asked to provide, and I wasn't here for the last session, so maybe somebody gave a great definition, but typically when I'm getting those requests, I'm not getting a great definition for that. We want cyber terrorism coverage. What does that mean? Is somebody domestically a terrorist? Is that covered? People in ANON aren't limited to other countries. They're right here at home. So what is terrorism? What is it people are nervous about? Because if it's the acts of foreign governments piece of that, well, that's something that's probably excluded. But if it's an individual acting in a foreign country, probably not excluded. Now, we've had no claims of the sort, so I can't really comment on actual experience, but that's my take.
Yeah, and I think the comment was made on the last panel too about, when does a cyber terrorism act effectively become an act of war? And most policies do include, war exclusions in them. So it is that fine line. I think it's something that we as carriers are all sort of grappling with, particularly when you start elevating it to more of a macroeconomic level and you talk about attacks on U.S. government, or you attack, one government to another, as opposed to company, which is historically where we've seen the cyber extortion piece and the cyber terrorism piece sort of come into play. I think it takes a whole new element when you look at it more from a macro perspective.